The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel sparkled with success. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over executives in tailored suits and cocktail dresses, their laughter harmonizing with the soft jazz quartet. At the center of it all stood Catherine, radiant in midnight blue, accepting congratulations on her directorship announcement. In the corner, Martin watched with quiet pride. 6 years ago, he'd stepped away from his own career to support her rise, managing their household while she climbed the corporate ladder at his company. Though few knew he was the actual owner, Catherine tapped her glass for attention. "I'd like to thank those who made this possible," she began. The crowd hushed. Martin straightened his tie, ready for his discreet acknowledgement. "Especially David," she continued, nodding toward her handsome colleague, "whose brilliant mentorship and personal support have been invaluable." Martin's smile froze as she added, "Unlike my husband, who's been little more than boring background furniture in my life." The crowd's uncomfortable silence was deafening. Martin stood perfectly still, dignified despite the public humiliation, while his mind reeled with one thought: she had no idea who truly owned the company she thought she was conquering. Martin Chambers adjusted his burgundy tie with practiced precision, the morning light streaming through his home office window. At 58, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who once commanded boardrooms, but had chosen a different path. Today was Catherine's day, the culmination of 6 years of her ascent at Meridian Technologies. "Will there be anything else for the arrangement, sir?" asked Eleanor, their housekeeper of 15 years, standing at the doorway with clipboard in hand. "Just confirm the champagne is Veuve Clicquot. It's her favorite." Martin smiled, his voice carrying the same authoritative warmth that had once closed million-dollar deals. "And make sure the florist included those blue orchids." Eleanor nodded, with a respect that went beyond employer-employee formality. "Already confirmed, sir, and Mr. Reynolds called to verify you approved the final guest list. Thank him for his thoroughness." Martin turned to his desk, briefly scanning a quarterly report he'd privately reviewed before Catherine had. Old habits. As Eleanor departed, Martin's gaze settled on the photograph of Catherine accepting her first promotion at Meridian, his company, though few knew that fact. 6 years ago, he'd made the decision that surprised their social circle, stepping back from his CEO position to support her career while maintaining ownership quietly through holding companies. He straightened his cufflinks, the same platinum set he'd worn when signing his first major acquisition. Some executive habits remained, subtly woven into his supportive husband role. Martin felt no regret for his choice, only quiet satisfaction in Catherine's success, which was, in many ways, an extension of his own vision. The celebration tonight would be perfect. He'd arranged every detail, just as he had arranged the path for her ascent, not by nepotism, but by creating opportunities for her genuine talent to shine. The sleek Mercedes handled the afternoon curves with precision as Martin drove toward downtown, where Meridian Technologies headquarters dominated the skyline. The dashboard clock showed 3:45, plenty of time before the 6:00 p.m. ceremony. His eyes caught the gleam of his class ring in the sunlight. Princeton, 1989. The memory surfaced unbidden, the boardroom of First Capital Ventures 25 years earlier. "Chambers, you're either brilliant or insane," Jackson had said, leaning forward across the table. "Buying that failing tech firm when everyone else is running for the hills." Martin had simply smiled. "Their infrastructure is sound. Their leadership isn't." "And you think you can do better?" The skepticism had been palpable. "I know I can." 3 years later, Meridian Technologies had tripled in value under his leadership. Martin shifted lanes, the present reasserting itself. The company logo, his design, adorned a billboard ahead. He'd built Meridian from struggling startup to industry leader through the 90s and early 2000s, establishing himself as an innovative but measured force in the tech sector. Then Catherine had joined the marketing department. Brilliant, ambitious, and surprisingly complementary to his management style. Their marriage had come 2 years later, and for a while, they'd been the power couple of the industry. "You're really stepping back?" His CFO had been incredulous when Martin announced his decision. "You're at the top of your game." "I'm not leaving," he'd explained, fingers tapping on the ownership documents. "I'm investing in new leadership while maintaining controlling interest." The arrangement had been simple. He would step back, Catherine would advance on merit, and he would maintain quiet ownership through holding companies. It had given her room to grow while allowing him to support her career and manage their home life. As he pulled into the underground parking garage, his reserved space maintained despite his ostensible retirement, Martin felt the weight of the gold signet ring on his finger. Some symbols of authority remained, even when willingly set aside. The gleaming lobby of Meridian Technologies bustled with pre-celebration activity. Martin stepped through the security doors, nodding at the guards who still stood straighter in his presence, despite the years of his public absence from leadership. "Mr. Chambers, wonderful to see you, sir." Thomas, the head of facilities, approached with an extended hand. "The grand ballroom is almost ready. I've personally overseen the setup as you requested." "Thank you, Thomas. Catherine will appreciate the attention to detail." Martin noted the man's slight hesitation. "Is everything all right?" "Oh, yes, sir. Perfect." Thomas's eyes darted briefly toward the executive elevator. "Ms. Reynolds from HR asked if you'd be attending the pre-ceremony executive gathering." "I wasn't aware there was one." Martin kept his expression neutral despite the unexpected information. Catherine hadn't mentioned any pre-ceremony meeting. As he moved through the main floor, Martin observed staff reactions, the respectful nods from veterans who remembered his leadership days, but also curious glances and whispered conversations that stopped as he approached. Near the marketing department, a conversation between 2 younger employees caught his attention. "Can't believe David got—" Their voices hushed immediately upon noticing him. "Good afternoon," Martin said pleasantly. "Looking forward to tonight's announcement?" "Yes, sir," the young woman responded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "It's an exciting time for the company." Martin continued toward the ballroom, where preparations were in full swing. The displays he'd approved featured Catherine's professional journey, though conspicuously light on her early years when they'd worked together. Mr. Chambers, Patricia Wells, board secretary and one of his longest-serving employees, approached with obvious relief. "I'm so glad you're here early. Is something wrong, Patricia?" "Not wrong, exactly." She lowered her voice. "There have been some changes to the program, last-minute adjustments requested by Ms. Chambers and Mr. Forsyth." David Forsyth, Catherine's mentor from the strategic development team. Martin had noticed his name appearing with increasing frequency in company communications. "What kind of changes?" Martin asked, maintaining his composed exterior despite a growing sense of unease. "The speaking order, some of the acknowledgments." Patricia hesitated. "Mr. Forsyth will be introducing Miss Chambers instead of Chairman Reynolds." Martin processed this information, the pieces assembling into a pattern he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Around him, the celebration space gleamed with perfection, the very celebration he had meticulously planned to honor his wife's achievement. "I see," he said finally, his calm voice masking the first flicker of concern. "Well, we should respect the director's wishes on her special day, shouldn't we?" Patricia's sympathetic expression suggested she understood far more than she was saying. "The guests will be arriving soon, sir. Shall I show you to your seat?" The grand ballroom of the Meridian Technologies headquarters sparkled with success and ambition. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over 200 of the industry's elite in formal attire, champagne flutes catching the light as they clinked in celebration. Martin found himself seated at table 7, not at the head table where his wife Catherine would soon be honored, but 3 tables removed from the center of attention. "Quite the turnout," remarked Harrison Wells, a senior board member seated beside Martin. "Your wife has certainly made her mark." "She has," Martin agreed, his pride genuine despite the unexpected seating arrangement. "Catherine has always had remarkable vision." Across the room, Catherine stood radiant in a tailored midnight blue dress, her auburn hair elegantly styled, surrounded by a circle of admirers. She hadn't acknowledged Martin's arrival beyond a brief wave from across the room. Instead, her attention focused on David Forsyth, her mentor from strategic development, a handsome man 15 years her junior, whose hand seemed permanently affixed to the small of her back. "Chambers." Chairman Reynolds nodded as he passed Martin's table. "Surprised to see you relegated to the provinces. I thought you'd be up front for your wife's big moment." "The director should be the focus tonight," Martin replied diplomatically, though the question echoed his own thoughts. At the front of the room, David leaned close to Catherine's ear, whispering something that made her laugh with uncharacteristic abandon. Her hand lingered on his arm longer than professional courtesy required. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the evening's host, "please take your seats as we prepare to honor our new Director of Operations." Martin watched as Catherine made her way to the head table, David following closely behind. Neither glanced in his direction. The program in Martin's hand listed him nowhere in the evening's proceedings, another detail that contradicted what Catherine had told him about the celebration he had largely arranged. "Something's off tonight," Wells muttered, his eyes tracking the same scene Martin observed. "Politics at play, I suspect." "Perhaps," Martin replied calmly, though beneath his composed exterior, confusion was giving way to the first stirrings of suspicion. The lights dimmed slightly as David Forsyth approached the podium, microphone in hand. "It's my distinct privilege to introduce a woman who needs no introduction, our new Director of Operations, Catherine Chambers." The crowd's applause seemed to echo the growing distance between Martin and the celebration he had helped orchestrate. Catherine approached the podium with confident strides, her smile dazzling under the spotlight. The room fell silent in anticipation. Martin felt a small measure of pride, despite his growing unease. She had indeed become the powerful executive he'd always believed she could be. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Catherine began, her voice carrying the polished professionalism that had become her trademark. "This is truly a milestone for Meridian Technologies, and I'm honored to accept this directorship." Martin maintained his attentive expression, hands folded calmly on the table, despite the conspicuous absence of any mention of their partnership. "Success in this industry isn't achieved alone," she continued. "I'd like to acknowledge those who've been instrumental in my journey." She began with her department heads, then board members who'd supported her initiatives. Martin waited for his acknowledgement, some small recognition of the foundation he'd provided both professionally and personally. Instead, Catherine's voice warmed as she turned toward David Forsyth. "But my deepest gratitude goes to David, whose brilliant strategic guidance transformed my approach to leadership. Without his vision and personal support, I wouldn't be standing here today." Their exchanged glance carried an intimacy that sent a jolt of realization through Martin. The room seemed to still as several guests darted uncomfortable looks in his direction. When I compare the exhilarating partnership David and I have developed to my home life, Catherine continued, her tone shifting from professional to dismissive, well, let's just say that living with someone whose idea of excitement is reorganizing his sock drawer has made me appreciate genuine passion all the more. Scattered, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the room. Martin's face remained impassive through years of business negotiation discipline, though his knuckles whitened around his water glass. "The truth is," Catherine said, her voice carrying a cruel edge now, "success requires surrounding yourself with people who elevate you, not those who—" Her eyes finally found Martin in the crowd. "Bore you with their predictable domesticity while claiming some credit for your achievements." The silence in the room was deafening. Martin could feel the collective discomfort of 200 guests witnessing his public humiliation. Yet he sat perfectly still, back straight, expression controlled, the same posture that had carried him through countless high-stakes negotiations. "So here's to new beginnings," Catherine concluded, raising her glass toward David, "and to those who truly deserve to share in this success." The applause that followed was hesitant, awkward, a social obligation rather than genuine enthusiasm. Martin noticed several board members exchanging troubled glances, but his focus remained on maintaining his dignity in the face of this unexpected and calculated betrayal. Martin navigated through the crowd with practiced composure, accepting sympathetic glances and awkward shoulder pats with a dignified nod. The celebration continued around him, champagne flowing, photographs being taken, while he moved with singular purpose toward Catherine, who stood surrounded by well-wishers near the dessert table. "Catherine." His voice was low but firm as he reached her circle. "A word, please." She turned, champagne flute in hand, her smile faltering only slightly. "Martin, enjoying the party?" "Privately," he insisted, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. With obvious reluctance, she excused herself and followed him to a partially secluded area behind a decorative column, still within sight of the celebration, but offering a modicum of privacy. "What exactly was that?" Martin asked, his tone controlled despite the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "What was what?" Catherine's feigned innocence didn't reach her eyes, which held a coldness he had never seen directed at him before. "You humiliated me in front of the entire company, people I built relationships with for decades." Catherine sipped her champagne, unconcerned. "Don't be so sensitive, Martin. It was a joke." "A joke." He kept his voice measured, though several nearby guests had noticed their conversation and were studiously pretending not to observe. "Publicly declaring that I bore you and dismissing 6 years of support as predictable domesticity is your idea of humor?" "Oh, please." Catherine's professional mask slipped, revealing contempt. "Let's not pretend you've been anything but a glorified house husband riding on my coattails these past years." The calculated cruelty of her words struck Martin like a physical blow, but decades of business discipline kept his expression neutral. "I see." He studied her face, searching for any remnant of the woman he thought he'd married. "And David? Is he just your mentor, Catherine?" Before she could answer, David appeared at her elbow, his proprietary stance making the answer abundantly clear. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his tone suggesting Martin was the intruder. "Fine," Catherine replied, placing her hand on David's arm. Martin was just leaving to get some air. Wells approached, providing a moment of supportive presence. "Chambers, the chairman was asking after you." Martin nodded appreciatively at the graceful interruption before turning back to Catherine. "This conversation isn't finished." "Actually, it is," she replied with chilling finality. "Tomorrow we can discuss how to make this transition amicable for everyone." As Martin turned to leave, her words followed him. "Don't make this difficult, Martin. You've always been good at fading into the background. Now is no different." He walked away with measured steps, back straight, head high, every inch the executive he had once been and would perhaps need to be again. The celebration continued around him, a surreal backdrop to the collapse of his marriage and the recognition that this betrayal might run deeper than he yet understood. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting stripes across the granite countertop where Martin stood preparing coffee. The house was unnaturally quiet, a stark contrast to the cacophony of last night's public humiliation. Their wedding photo still hung on the wall, Catherine in white, Martin in charcoal gray, both smiling with genuine hope for the future. The sound of Catherine's heels on the hardwood announced her arrival. She paused in the doorway, her crisp navy suit a stark contrast to Martin's casual Saturday attire. "I made coffee," he said, his voice neutral as he slid a cup toward her. Catherine accepted it with hesitation. "Thank you." After a moment, she added, "About last night." Martin waited, his expression composed despite the churning emotions beneath. "I may have gone too far with some of my comments," she offered, not quite meeting his eyes. "The stress of the promotion, the champagne. You understand how these corporate events can get." "Do I?" Martin's response was measured, neither accepting nor rejecting her partial apology. Catherine sighed, setting down her cup. "Look, Martin, I'm sorry if you felt embarrassed. That wasn't my intention." "Wasn't it?" He studied her face, searching for sincerity and finding little. "Publicly calling me boring and dismissing our marriage while practically announcing your affair with David. That seems fairly intentional." She flinched at the directness. "It wasn't an announcement, and David is important to my career." "I imagine so," Martin replied, the understatement hanging between them. Catherine's phone chimed. She checked it quickly, her expression shifting to something more urgent. "I need to go in today. Emergency at the office." "On a Saturday, the day after your promotion celebration?" "The director position doesn't observe weekends," she replied, a hint of her public persona returning. "We can talk more tonight. I truly am sorry about how things came across." Martin nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting her words. "Will David be at this emergency meeting too?" Catherine's momentary hesitation told him everything. "The strategic team needs to address some urgent developments." "I see." Martin maintained his dignity despite the transparent excuse. "Good luck with your meeting." As Catherine gathered her things, she paused at the door. "Martin, I know we have things to work through, but I hope you understand that last night was primarily professional posturing. Some distance between us publicly helps my authority." He met her gaze steadily. "And privately." She looked away. "We'll talk tonight." After the door closed behind her, Martin stood motionless in the kitchen, processing her performance. Her apology had sounded rehearsed, lacking genuine remorse. Whatever game Catherine was playing extended beyond last night's humiliation, and Martin felt the first stirrings of strategic caution, a business instinct long dormant but never forgotten. The doorbell rang at precisely 11:30 a.m. Martin opened it to find Harrison Wells, the senior board member who had sat beside him during last night's debacle. "Chambers?" Wells nodded, his weathered face serious beneath silver hair. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Martin replied, genuinely surprised. "Come in." In Martin's home office, the two men settled into leather chairs, the formality of their postures reflecting years in corporate environments rather than the casual setting. "I'll be direct," Wells began, declining the offered coffee. "Last night was unconscionable." Martin appreciated the straightforward approach. "Catherine offered something resembling an apology this morning." "Did she?" Wells raised an eyebrow. "And did that apology include any mention of the restructuring plan she and Forsyth have been developing?" Martin kept his expression neutral, despite the jolt of surprise. "Restructuring wasn't mentioned." Wells leaned forward, his voice lowering despite their privacy. "Martin, I've respected your decision to step back and support Catherine's career, but I've also respected the fact that you still own controlling interest in Meridian Technologies, even if most employees have forgotten that detail." "She mentioned an emergency meeting today," Martin offered. "Something requiring the strategic team." "Emergency indeed." Wells's expression darkened. "I've served on enough boards to recognize a power play. For the past month, Catherine and Forsyth have been meeting with venture capital representatives, the kind who specialize in aggressive acquisitions and management restructuring." Martin processed this information with outward calm, though his mind raced with implications. "You've seen evidence of this?" "Overheard enough to concern me. They speak carefully around board members, but less so around aging executives they consider irrelevant." Wells's smile held no humor. "Being underestimated has its advantages." "Why tell me this, Harrison?" Martin asked, though he suspected the answer. "Because Meridian is your legacy. Because 30 years of business ethics shouldn't be dismantled for personal ambition." Wells straightened. "And because what I witnessed last night wasn't just a wife humiliating her husband. It was the first public move in pushing you out completely." Martin nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "Catherine mentioned professional posturing this morning." "Professional indeed." Wells stood, moving toward the door before turning back. "If I were you, I'd check her home office before she returns. Catherine has always been meticulous with documentation, a habit you instilled in her." Martin remained seated, processing the implications. "I appreciate your candor, Harrison." "Loyalty may be unfashionable these days," Wells replied, "but some of us still value it." "You built something worth preserving, Martin." As Wells departed, Martin sat motionless, weighing moral considerations against self-preservation. Searching Catherine's office felt invasive, yet the warning rang true, aligning with his own growing suspicions and her transparent morning performance. After several minutes of contemplation, Martin made his decision. Some boundaries, once crossed, required pragmatic responses rather than blind faith. Martin stood at the threshold of Catherine's home office, a space he typically respected as her private domain. The modern desk, minimalist decor, and wall of achievements created a stark contrast to his own traditional office down the hall. With measured steps, he entered, his business instincts reawakening after years of dormancy. If Wells was correct, evidence would be methodically filed. Catherine had learned organizational discipline from him, after all. He began with her desk drawers, finding nothing but standard supplies. The computer would be password protected, and Martin had no intention of crossing that line. Instead, he turned to the credenza where Catherine kept hard copies of important documents. The first file contained standard company reports, nothing unusual. The second held personal financial statements. In the third, labeled simply, Strategic Planning, Martin found what he was looking for. A document titled Meridian Restructuring Initiative bore Catherine's name alongside David Forsyth's, Martin's jaw tightened as he scanned the executive summary. This proposal outlines a comprehensive restructuring of Meridian Technologies' ownership and management structure, transferring controlling interest from legacy holding companies to a new executive partnership with strategic investment from Vertex Capital Partners. His own holding companies, the vehicles through which he maintained ownership, were described as outdated structures hampering innovation, with a recommendation for complete dissolution and asset transfer. Martin's hand remained steady as he turned pages, each revealing more of the elaborate plan to effectively steal his company. Financial projections, legal strategies, even a timeline that had begun 3 months ago when Catherine had first suggested he not attend certain board functions, to give her space to establish authority. A separate folder contained personal correspondence between Catherine and David, their affair documented in explicit detail alongside strategic planning for their professional future, a future that systematically erased Martin from both their lives. Most damning was a meeting agenda for Monday morning's emergency board session. The topic: proposal to restructure ownership and resolve conflicts of interest in legacy management arrangements. Martin's pulse remained measured even as the full scope of betrayal became clear. This wasn't just marital infidelity or public humiliation. It was a calculated corporate takeover of his life's work, leveraging their marriage as the mechanism. He carefully returned the documents to their original positions, closed the credenza, and stepped back to ensure nothing appeared disturbed. The methodical precision of his movements reflected decades of business discipline rather than the emotional turmoil brewing beneath. In his pocket, his phone vibrated with a message from Patricia Wells. Emergency board meeting called for Monday 8 a.m. Attendance mandatory for all directors and shareholders of record. Catherine and David presenting special proposal. Martin stood perfectly still in the center of the room, processing not just the personal betrayal, but the comprehensive nature of the attack on everything he had built. The businessman who had created Meridian Technologies from struggling startup to industry leader would need to re-emerge, and quickly. Catherine had severely miscalculated. She had forgotten who had taught her strategic thinking in the first place. Monday morning arrived with cold clarity. Martin entered Meridian Technologies' lobby at precisely 7:30 a.m., dressed in his finest charcoal suit, determined to confront Catherine before the emergency board meeting. The security guard's uncomfortable expression immediately signaled something was wrong. "Mr. Chambers, sir," the guard began, not meeting Martin's eyes. "I need to ask you to wait here while I make a call." "Is there a problem, Carl?" Martin asked, though he already suspected the answer. "New security protocols, sir. I'm sorry." Before Carl could reach for his phone, Catherine emerged from the elevator bank, flanked by David Forsyth and 2 security officers Martin didn't recognize. "Martin." Catherine's voice carried the sterile efficiency she reserved for terminating employees. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Martin maintained a calm demeanor despite the audience of employees gathering in the lobby. "I thought we should discuss certain documents before the board meeting." Catherine's expression flickered briefly before resuming its professional mask. "I'm not sure what documents you're referring to, but this isn't the time or place. You no longer have clearance to be on company premises." "I wasn't aware I needed clearance to enter the company I founded," Martin replied evenly. "That was a long time ago," Catherine countered, her voice projecting for the benefit of onlookers. "Your consultant role ended when you chose to step back. Security has been instructed not to admit you without an escort." David stepped forward, his proprietary stance beside Catherine, now shameless. "Martin, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Catherine has been generous in her separation proposal. Several employees averted their eyes, the public humiliation unfolding like a corporate execution. I see. Martin addressed Catherine directly, ignoring David entirely. And my shareholder status? That's what today's board meeting will address, Catherine replied with cold confidence. Your proxy rights were transferred to me years ago, as you'll recall. Martin maintained perfect composure, though the public nature of this confrontation, clearly staged for maximum witnesses, confirmed how thoroughly Catherine had planned his elimination. Gentlemen, Catherine nodded to the security officers, please escort Mr. Chambers out. That won't be necessary, Martin replied, buttoning his suit jacket with dignity. I can find my own way. As he turned to leave, Catherine added for the benefit of watching employees. I'm sorry it's come to this, Martin. We all appreciate your past contributions, but Meridian needs forward-thinking leadership now. Martin paused, meeting her gaze one final time. We'll see what the board decides. His measured tone contained neither threat nor surrender, just simple fact. He walked out with his head high, aware of hushed whispers behind him, the lobby doors closing on what Catherine clearly believed was the final chapter of his corporate life. Martin Chambers? My God, I hardly recognized you. Martin looked up from his coffee to see Richard Donovan, former CFO of Meridian's main competitor, approaching his table at Winston's, an upscale restaurant frequented by the business elite. Richard, it's been a while. Martin gestured to the empty chair across from him. Mind if I join you? Sounds like you've had an interesting morning. Richard settled into the seat, his expression a mixture of curiosity and awkward sympathy. News travels fast, Martin observed, maintaining his composed exterior. The financial district runs on gossip more than money. Richard signaled for coffee. 3 people called me before lunch. Apparently, you were escorted from Meridian's lobby? That's somewhat exaggerated, Martin replied. Though Catherine did make a point of revoking my access. Richard studied him for a moment. Meridian's been the subject of intense speculation lately. Word is that Catherine and that young strategic director are positioning for some kind of restructuring with outside capital. Vertex Capital Partners, Martin supplied, observing Richard's surprise at his knowledge. You've heard, then? Richard's discomfort eased slightly. There's a rather unflattering narrative circulating about you, I'm afraid. I'd be interested to hear it, Martin said, his voice steady despite the internal blow of having his reputation dismantled alongside his marriage. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Well, the story being told is that you've been something of a figurehead for years. That Catherine's been the real business mind while you've been living off the company's success. He hesitated. There are suggestions that your stepped-back role wasn't entirely voluntary. I see. Martin took a measured sip of coffee. For what it's worth, those of us who remember your leadership days don't buy it, Richard added. The Martin Chambers I knew turned a failing tech company into an industry leader. That was a long time ago, according to Catherine. Maybe too long. Richard leaned forward. Look, Martin, I don't mean to overstep, but are you just going to let them push you out? The board meeting's in less than 24 hours. If they've lined up the votes. Martin maintained his inscrutable expression. What would you suggest? Fight back. Richard's directness carried the bluntness of their former competitive relationship. The Martin Chambers I knew wouldn't let anyone, wife or not, dismantle what he built. After Richard departed, Martin remained at the table, surrounded by business leaders who now watched him with curious glances. The business journal on a nearby table featured Catherine's promotion announcement, the article subtly positioning her as Meridian's visionary leader with no mention of Martin's founding role. The systematic erasure of his contributions felt more devastating than the public humiliation. For the first time since the betrayal began, Martin felt the full weight of how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered by the woman he had supported and loved. Darkness enveloped Martin's home office, the only illumination coming from a single desk lamp that cast long shadows across his achievements. Industry awards, framed deal announcements, and photographs from Meridian's early days surrounded him like artifacts from another life. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11. Catherine hadn't returned home, likely staying with David as they prepared for tomorrow's board meeting. The house felt cavernous in its emptiness, echoing the hollow feeling spreading through Martin's chest. He swirled the untouched scotch in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. 6 years ago, he had made what he believed was his wisest decision, stepping back to support Catherine while maintaining ownership through proxy arrangements that now seemed dangerously vulnerable. Was it wisdom or weakness? He asked the silent room. The question cut to his core. Had his desire to support his wife been a strength of character or a fundamental miscalculation? Had his choice to lead from behind been noble or naive? A photograph on the credenza caught his attention. Martin and Catherine at Meridian's 20th anniversary celebration, both smiling. He'd been so certain then that their partnership represented the best of both worlds, her rising career supported by his quiet guidance, his legacy secured through her success. Martin set down his untouched drink and moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. The company he'd built from struggling startup to industry leader was poised to be taken from him in less than 12 hours. His wife of 15 years had systematically betrayed him, professionally and personally. His reputation had been deliberately dismantled to facilitate his removal. "All because I chose to step back," he murmured. "All because I believe support was stronger than control." The principles that had guided his decision, partnership, mutual support, putting Catherine's growth before his ego, now seemed painfully naive in the face of such calculated betrayal. For a moment, Martin allowed himself to experience the full devastation, the humiliation, the loss, the questioning of every choice that had led to this moment. Had his entire approach to life been fundamentally flawed? The phone's sharp ring cut through his introspection. At this hour, it could only be urgent news. "Martin Chambers," he answered, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil. "Mr. Chambers, it's Patricia." His longtime executive secretary's voice carried both urgency and loyalty. "I'm sorry to call so late, but you need to know. They've moved the board meeting to 8 a.m., and they're bringing in lawyers from Vertex Capital. The proxy documentation is being challenged on technical grounds." Martin straightened, the businessman in him immediately recognizing the strategic implications. "They're accelerating the timeline." "Yes, sir. And," Patricia hesitated, "Mr. Wells asked me to tell you he's secured the Harrington conference room at the Capitol Tower for 6 a.m. He said you'd understand." Something shifted in Martin's expression, a subtle transformation from wounded husband to strategic chess player. "Tell him I'll be there." As he hung up, Martin turned back to the wall of achievements, seeing them not as relics of a past life, but as reminders of the strategic acumen he had temporarily set aside. "Perhaps it's time to remember who built Meridian in the first place," he said to the empty room, his voice carrying a newfound resolve that suggested Catherine's victory was far from assured. The Harrington conference room at Capitol Tower gleamed with old money elegance at 6 a.m. Martin arrived to find William Hargrove already waiting, his 80-year-old frame still commanding respect in a perfectly tailored suit. As Meridian's original angel investor and Martin's longtime mentor, Hargrove had guided Martin through every major business crisis for 30 years. "Right on time," Hargrove noted, pushing a steaming cup of coffee across the polished table. "You look like hell, son." "I've had better weeks," Martin admitted, taking the seat across from his mentor. "Harrison filled me in." Hargrove's weathered face reflected disappointment rather than sympathy. "Though I must say, I've been watching this train wreck coming for some time." "You could have warned me," Martin said, a hint of the old executive emerging in his tone. "Would you have listened?" Hargrove countered. "The Martin Chambers who built Meridian Technologies into an industry leader wouldn't have let his wife or anyone systematically dismantle his authority." The blunt assessment stung with truth. Martin took a careful sip of coffee before responding. "I wanted to support Catherine's growth. I thought stepping back was the right thing to do." "Supporting someone's growth doesn't require erasing yourself," Hargrove replied, his direct style unchanged by age. "Tell me, why did you really step back?" Martin considered the question with newfound clarity. "I believed partnership meant putting her success above my ego." "And what did she believe?" "That my stepping back was an opportunity." The realization crystallized as Martin spoke. "Not for partnership, but for replacement." Hargrove nodded approvingly. "Now we're getting somewhere. The Martin Chambers I mentored understood the difference between collaboration and capitulation." "That Martin seems like another lifetime ago." "He's still there." Hargrove tapped the table emphatically. "The man who turned a failing tech company into Meridian didn't disappear. He just forgot who he was." Something stirred in Martin, the dormant business instincts that had built his company awakening from their long slumber. "The emergency board meeting is in 2 hours," Martin said, his mind beginning to shift from wounded husband to strategic thinker. "And your legal position?" "Catherine claims my proxy rights were transferred to her years ago." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Were they?" "Not in the way she's suggesting." Martin's voice gained strength. "We should review the actual documentation." "Now you're thinking like an executive again." Hargrove smiled for the first time. "I've taken the liberty of calling Robert Chen. He's waiting for us at his office." As they rose to leave, Hargrove placed a firm hand on Martin's shoulder. "Remember, son, true strength isn't about domination or surrender. It's about standing firmly in your truth while still maintaining your integrity. That's the Martin Chambers who built Meridian." Martin nodded, feeling the weight of those words resonate with something fundamental within him, a clear-eyed strength that had been dormant but never truly gone. Robert Chen's corner office at Jensen Associates reflected the measured confidence of a top corporate attorney. Martin placed his portfolio on the polished conference table, original company documents arranged in precise chronological order. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice, Robert," Martin said, his demeanor more executive than supplicant for the first time in years. "When William Hargrove and Martin Chambers request an urgent meeting, I make time." Chen adjusted his glasses, studying Martin with analytical precision. "I understand there's an ownership dispute regarding Meridian Technologies." "My wife believes she can restructure the company's ownership without my consent," Martin explained. "She's scheduled an emergency board meeting for 8 a.m. Chen nodded, opening the first document Martin had provided. "Let's start with the fundamentals. Who currently holds legal ownership of Meridian Technologies?" "The majority stake is held by 3 holding companies: Chambers Capital, Meridian Holdings Group, and Westlake Investments. Martin's response came with practiced fluency. I am the sole owner of all three entities. And these proxy arrangements with Catherine? Chen asked, examining the next document. Limited operational authority only, Martin clarified. Catherine received proxy rights for day-to-day management decisions and board representation, but not for ownership restructuring or asset transfers. Chen studied the documentation with meticulous attention, occasionally making notes. After several minutes of silence, he looked up with clear certainty. These documents are unambiguous. Your wife has no legal authority to transfer ownership or restructure the holding companies without your explicit written consent. Martin felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Then the board can't approve this restructuring? Not legally, no. Chen's precision reflected years of corporate law experience. Any attempt to transfer controlling interest to Vertex Capital without your signature would constitute corporate theft. Catherine seems quite confident, Martin observed, recalling her dismissive attitude. She may be relying on this clause, Chen said, indicating a section of the proxy agreement. It grants her authority to represent your interests in all matters of company governance, but that's standard operational language. It doesn't extend to fundamental ownership changes. Martin nodded, his strategic mind fully engaged now. What would be your recommended approach for the board meeting? Direct and factual, Chen advised, selecting several key documents. Present these to establish clear ownership. Remind the board of their fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, meaning you, and... Chen hesitated briefly. And? Martin prompted. Be prepared for this to become personal, Chen finished. Business disputes between spouses rarely remain purely professional. Martin considered this with newfound clarity. The business and personal elements became inseparable the moment Catherine decided to use our marriage as a mechanism for corporate takeover. Chen's expression reflected professional respect. You seem remarkably composed for someone facing both a hostile takeover and marital betrayal simultaneously. Clarity has a way of focusing the mind, Martin replied, gathering the essential documents, and it appears I have the legal foundation I need. As they prepared to leave, Chen offered one final observation. For what it's worth, Mr. Chambers, your wife's strategy reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of who you are. She's prepared to face the supportive husband, not the business strategist who built Meridian Technologies. Martin straightened his tie, a gesture that now carried renewed purpose. That's a miscalculation she'll soon regret. The private meeting room at Capitol Tower had transformed into a strategic command center by early afternoon. Maps of Meridian's organizational structure covered one wall, key financial data another. Martin stood at the head of the table, jacket removed, sleeves rolled up. The executive fully reawakened. The legal position is clear, Martin explained to his impromptu team. Patricia, his loyal secretary, Harrison Wells from the board, and William Hargrove, who observed with quiet approval. But we need to anticipate Catherine and David's countermoves. They'll claim the proxy agreement gives her full authority, Patricia suggested, her decades of corporate experience evident. Which Robert Chen has confirmed it doesn't, Martin countered, indicating the highlighted legal documents. But perception matters in the boardroom. We need to control the narrative from the moment I walk in. Wells nodded appreciatively. The Martin Chambers I remember could shift an entire board's perspective in 5 minutes. The element of surprise is our advantage, Martin continued, pacing with energized focus. Catherine believes I've been neutralized, first through public humiliation, then through the security theater at headquarters. She doesn't expect you to attend the meeting at all, Patricia added. Precisely. Martin tapped the board attendance records. And who's confirmed for tomorrow? Patricia consulted her notes. All 11 board members will be present. Based on my conversations, 4 are firmly in Catherine's camp, 3 are likely loyal to you, and 4 appear undecided. We need 6 votes to block the restructuring, Martin calculated. Assuming the loyal 3 hold, we need to convince 3 of the undecided. The strategy session continued with increasing momentum, Martin directing the analysis with decisive clarity. The transformation from supportive husband to corporate strategist was now complete, not as a regression, but as an integration of strength with wisdom. One final consideration, Hargrove interjected as they finalized the approach. Catherine is still your wife. How do you want to handle the personal element? The room fell silent, all eyes on Martin. This was the question that transcended business strategy, the human core of the situation. With dignity, Martin answered after thoughtful consideration, I won't seek vengeance or public humiliation, despite what she's done. Justice doesn't require cruelty. Hargrove nodded with evident approval. That's the difference between power and strength, son. As the session concluded, Martin retreated to prepare privately. In the adjoining bathroom, he changed into a fresh suit that Patricia had arranged, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, his signature look during Meridian's rise to prominence. He secured his platinum cufflinks, adjusted his burgundy tie, and studied his reflection. The man looking back wasn't just the supportive husband of recent years, nor merely the aggressive young executive of decades past. He was both and something more, a leader who had learned that true strength combined firm boundaries with compassion. Time to reclaim what's mine, Martin told his reflection, not just the company, but my sense of self-worth. He rejoined the others, his transformation evident in every aspect of his bearing. Patricia handed him his briefcase, newly packed with the essential documents for tomorrow's confrontation. Your car will be ready at 7 a.m., sir, she informed him with professional efficiency that barely contained her satisfaction. Will there be anything else? No, Patricia. Thank you. Martin's voice carried the quiet authority that had once defined him. I believe we're ready. Martin arrived at Meridian Technologies 30 minutes before the scheduled board meeting, his footsteps echoing through the still quiet executive floor. Patricia met him at the elevator with a key card that bypassed the security protocols Catherine had implemented. Everything's prepared as you requested, sir, she informed him, handing over a leather portfolio containing the essential documents. Thank you, Patricia. Martin's voice carried quiet authority as he surveyed the boardroom through the glass walls. Has anyone else arrived yet? Just Mr. Wells. He's waiting inside. Martin nodded and entered the boardroom where Harrison Wells stood examining the seating arrangement. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, name placards positioned precisely at each seat. I see Catherine has placed herself at the head of the table, Martin observed, picking up his own placard from a position near the middle. Not for long, Wells replied with a knowing smile. With deliberate movements, Martin began transforming the space. He placed his placard at the head position and moved Catherine's to his immediate right, still respectful, but clearly secondary. From his briefcase, he withdrew the original Meridian Technologies Incorporation documents and positioned them prominently before his seat. Patricia entered with a tray containing the company's founding artifacts, the first prototype of their breakthrough product, a framed photograph of Martin signing the initial venture capital agreement, and the company's seal he had designed himself 30 years earlier. The original company charter should be displayed as well, Martin directed, indicating a position where board members couldn't miss it as they entered. He methodically inspected each seat, adjusting angles for optimal sight lines to his position. The subtle choreography of power was familiar territory, muscle memory from decades of corporate leadership returning with practiced precision. The lawyers from Vertex Capital will expect to sit along the wall, Wells noted. They can observe from the anteroom, Martin countered. Only voting members at the table today. As the first board members began arriving, Martin greeted each with firm handshakes and direct eye contact, his poise transforming initial surprise at his presence into respectful acknowledgement. The nervous anticipation he had felt earlier had given way to methodical focus, the chess player seeing several moves ahead. "They're here," Patricia murmured, glancing toward the elevator lobby where Catherine and David had just emerged, accompanied by two men in expensive suits, presumably Vertex Capital representatives. Martin straightened his tie and took his position at the head of the table, the original founder and controlling owner of Meridian Technologies, prepared to reclaim what was rightfully his. Catherine's stride faltered visibly as she entered the boardroom. Her practiced executive smile froze at the sight of Martin seated at the head of the table, the company's founding artifacts displayed prominently before him. "Martin," she managed, quickly composing herself, "this is unexpected." "Is it?" Martin replied calmly, his voice carrying through the now silent room. "I believe the notice specified all shareholders of record were required to attend." David Forsyth stepped forward, his arm hovering possessively near Catherine's back. "This meeting was called to address conflicts of interest in legacy management structures. Your presence creates precisely such a conflict." "On the contrary," Martin responded, his tone measured but authoritative. "As the controlling shareholder of Meridian Technologies, my presence is not just appropriate, but necessary." The Vertex Capital representatives exchanged concerned glances as Catherine attempted to regain control of the situation. "Martin, perhaps we should discuss this privately before you propose restructuring my company without my consent." Martin opened the leather portfolio, revealing the documents within. "I believe we're all here now. The meeting can begin." As the remaining board members took their seats, Catherine reluctantly settled into the chair at Martin's right, while David sat further down the table, his confident demeanor noticeably diminished. "For the record," Martin began formally, "I am Martin Chambers, founder and controlling shareholder of Meridian Technologies through my ownership of Chambers Capital, Meridian Holdings Group, and Westlake Investments." He slid copies of the ownership certificates to each board member, the methodical distribution emphasizing his control of the situation. "Catherine was granted limited proxy rights for operational decisions," he continued, "but those rights specifically exclude any authority to transfer ownership or restructure the holding companies." Catherine leaned forward. "The proxy agreement clearly states I represent your interests in all matters of company governance." "Operational governance," Martin corrected, indicating the specific language in the document now displayed on the conference room screen. "Not ownership restructuring." "Our legal team has reviewed these agreements," one of the Vertex representatives interjected from his position against the wall. "From the anteroom, please," Martin directed without looking up. "Only board members at the table." The sharp instruction, delivered with quiet authority, sent the Vertex representatives retreating to the adjacent room, a power move that wasn't lost on the watching board members. "The proposal before this board," Martin continued, "would constitute an unauthorized transfer of controlling interest, which is both beyond Catherine's proxy authority and a violation of fiduciary responsibility to the majority shareholder, me." David attempted to salvage the situation. "The restructuring would bring significant new capital." "I'm well aware of what it would bring, Mr. Forsyth," Martin interrupted, his gaze steady. The question is what it would take away. He turned to address the full board. Each of you has a legal and ethical obligation to act in the best interest of the company's shareholders. The documents before you clearly establish that I remain the majority shareholder, regardless of narratives suggesting otherwise. Catherine's composure cracked slightly. Martin, you stepped away years ago. You can't just walk back in and— I step back from day-to-day operations, Martin corrected with calm precision. I never relinquished ownership, a distinction your proposal deliberately attempts to blur. The boardroom had fallen completely silent, the power dynamic shifting palpably with each exchange. The directors studied the documentation before them, several nodding in understanding of the legal reality Martin had established. I believe we're ready for a vote, Martin concluded, his quiet confidence filling the room. The proposal to restructure ownership requires a majority vote to proceed. All in favor? Only 3 hands rose in support of the restructuring proposal: Catherine, David, and 1 loyal board member. The remaining 8 directors kept their hands firmly on the table, their expressions reflecting a mixture of professional caution and newfound respect for the founder they had nearly forgotten. The motion fails, Martin announced, his tone businesslike rather than triumphant. Now, I'd like to propose a resolution affirming the current ownership structure and my position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Catherine paled. You can't seriously intend to push me out after 1 disagreement. This was hardly a disagreement, Catherine, Martin replied, meeting her gaze directly. It was an attempted corporate takeover using our marriage as the mechanism. The truth of his statement hung in the air, undeniable in the wake of the evidence presented. All in favor of reinstating Martin Chambers as CEO, Harrison Wells called for the vote. 9 hands rose immediately, with only Catherine and David abstaining. The outcome was decisive. The leadership transition accomplished with the efficiency that had once been Martin's hallmark. Thank you, Martin acknowledged, accepting the vote with dignified composure. My first act as CEO is to address the leadership structure moving forward. The board tensed visibly, anticipating the professional execution that typically followed such power struggles in corporate America. Catherine's face remained frozen in a mask of contained anger, while David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Catherine Chambers has demonstrated exceptional operational capabilities during her tenure, Martin began, surprising everyone in the room. Her strategic vision for our product development has been particularly valuable. Catherine's expression shifted to guarded confusion as Martin continued. I therefore propose that she retain her position as Director of Product Strategy, reporting directly to the CEO. Her compensation package will remain unchanged, though certain authority parameters will naturally be adjusted. A murmur of surprise rippled through the boardroom. This measured response, neither vindictive termination nor naive forgiveness, reflected a leadership philosophy that balanced justice with wisdom. As for Mr. Forsyth, Martin continued, his tone cooling slightly, his contract will be reviewed by our ethics committee in light of certain disclosure concerns that have come to my attention. David opened his mouth to protest, but Catherine placed a restraining hand on his arm, recognizing the relative leniency of Martin's decision regarding her own position. Are there any objections to this leadership transition plan? Martin asked, addressing the full board. The directors exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the balanced approach. No one spoke. Then this emergency meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene for our regular session next week to discuss operational priorities moving forward. As the board members filed out, many pausing to congratulate Martin on his return, Catherine remained seated, her expression unreadable. When only the two of them remained, Martin gathered his documents with methodical precision. "Why?" Catherine finally asked. "Why offer me any position after what I did?" Martin secured his briefcase before answering. "Because vindictiveness diminishes the victor, not the vanquished." He met her gaze with calm clarity. "And because you are genuinely talented at product strategy. My decision reflects both principles." He stood to leave, the reclaimed authority evident in his posture. "We should discuss the personal aspects of this situation separately from the business elements. My office, tomorrow at 10. As Martin exited the boardroom, his measured steps carried the quiet confidence of a man who had not only reclaimed his company, but had done so with the dignity and wisdom that true leadership required. Martin stood alone in the CEO office he hadn't occupied for 6 years, his victory both complete and complex. The boardroom confrontation had unfolded precisely as planned, the documentation irrefutable, the board's support secured, his leadership position reclaimed. The executive suite still held traces of Catherine's presence, her awards on the credenza, her personal items in the desk drawers, reminders of how thoroughly she had planned to erase him. He poured himself a modest scotch from the cabinet that had once been his, savoring the familiar burn as he contemplated the scheduled meeting with Catherine tomorrow. The temptation to extend her humiliation was surprisingly strong, to strip her of all authority, to make public the details of her attempted corporate theft, to ensure her professional reputation suffered as his had. "A full measure of justice," he murmured to the empty room, testing the words against his conscience. The office door opened after a brief knock, and William Hargrove entered without waiting for permission, the prerogative of a mentor who had known Martin since his 20s. "Congratulations," Hargrove said, settling into a visitor's chair without invitation. "Clean execution. Your boardroom skills haven't rusted at all." "Thank you." Martin indicated the Scotch bottle, but Hargrove declined with a small wave. "So," the older man prompted after a moment of silence, "what happens to Catherine now?" Martin studied his glass. "I've preserved her position in product strategy. It's where her talents truly lie." "Generous," Hargrove observed, his tone neutral. "Some might say too generous, given the circumstances." "And what would you say?" The older man considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. "I'd say the measure of a man isn't revealed in victory, but in how he handles victory." Martin nodded slowly. "There's a part of me that wants her to suffer as I did." "Of course there is," Hargrove acknowledged. "That's natural. The question is whether you allow that part to determine your actions." The silence between them stretched, filled with the weight of moral decision. Finally, Hargrove stood to leave. "I won't tell you what to do," he said at the door, "but I will remind you of something you once told me when you were building Meridian, that true leadership is defined not by control, but by bringing out the best in people, even when they've shown you their worst." After Hargrove departed, Martin moved to the window overlooking the city lights. The company he had built, lost, and reclaimed spread before him. Tomorrow's conversation with Catherine would set the tone for both their professional and personal futures. He reached for the phone, his decision crystallizing into clarity. The path of vengeance would diminish him far more than it would punish her. There was a better way forward, one that honored both justice and his own integrity. "Patricia," he said when his secretary answered, Please confirm my meeting with Catherine for tomorrow at 10. And arrange for the legal team to prepare separation agreements, both professional and personal. The conference room Martin had chosen for their meeting offered neutral ground. Neither his reclaimed office nor Catherine's diminished one. A professional setting for what needed to be a clear-eyed conversation. Water glasses and a carafe had been placed at measured intervals along the polished table, creating a deliberate formality. When Catherine entered precisely at 10, her professional mask was firmly in place. Designer suit, perfect makeup, the armor of corporate poise. Only the slight tension around her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. "Thank you for coming," Martin began, his tone businesslike but not cold. "Did I have a choice?" A hint of defensiveness colored her question. "We always have choices, Catherine. That's partly why we're here." She took the seat across from him, maintaining the physical and emotional distance between them. "If this is about my position, I'm prepared to make a case for why the product strategy role is—" "This isn't a negotiation," Martin interrupted gently. "Your position is secure based on merit, as I stated yesterday. This conversation is about understanding." Catherine's professional veneer faltered slightly. "Understanding what? Why?" Martin's gaze was steady, neither accusatory nor wounded. "Why the public humiliation, the affair, the corporate takeover attempt, all of it?" For a moment, Catherine seemed ready to deliver another practiced response. But something in Martin's composed demeanor made her reconsider. "You really want to know?" she asked, her voice suddenly more authentic than it had been in months. "I do." Catherine looked away, gathering her thoughts. At first, it was just ambition. Stepping into the spotlight you vacated felt powerful. Then it became something else. She met his eyes directly. "The more success I achieved, the more I resented that it happened within the framework you created. So you wanted to erase my contribution entirely. I wanted to prove I could succeed without you." The admission seemed to surprise even her. David understood that. He made me feel like my own person, not an extension of Martin Chambers' vision. "And the public humiliation at the celebration?" Catherine had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That was excessive. The champagne, the moment, David encouraging me to establish complete independence. By deliberately diminishing me." "Yes." Her acknowledgement hung between them. Martin nodded, absorbing this truth without visible anger. "And the takeover attempt?" "Once we started down that path, each step made the next seem logical." Catherine's corporate polish had completely fallen away. "David convinced me that your proxy rights could be interpreted broadly enough to restructure ownership. The Vertex Capital partners agreed." "They were wrong," Martin said simply. "Clearly." A flash of the old Catherine emerged, the strategic thinker acknowledging a miscalculation. Martin leaned forward slightly. "Catherine, I didn't step back to diminish you or to control you from the shadows. I genuinely believed in your abilities and wanted to support your growth." "I know that now," she admitted. But somewhere along the way, support started feeling like shadow. The truth of their marriage hung between them, his well-intentioned support perceived as an inescapable legacy, her ambition twisting into resentment and betrayal. "So where do we go from here?" Catherine asked finally. Martin placed a folder on the table between them. "I've had legal prepare 2 agreements. The first outlines your continuing role at Meridian, reporting structures and compensation. And the second? Divorce terms." Martin's voice remained steady. "Equitable division of personal assets, no alimony in either direction, given our respective positions." Catherine studied him, seeming to truly see him for the first time in years. "That's fair, more than fair, considering everything. I'm not interested in punishment, Catherine, just clarity and appropriate boundaries. She nodded slowly, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for being caught, but for how I handled everything. I believe you, Martin replied, his tone suggesting that while forgiveness might be possible, trust would be a separate journey. The company announcement regarding restructuring is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I hope you'll be there in your professional capacity. I will. Catherine gathered her composure as she stood to leave. And Martin, thank you for taking the better path. I'm not sure I would have in your position. That's why boundaries matter, he replied simply. They reveal character, both in how we set them and how we respect them. As Catherine departed, Martin remained seated, the weight of resolution settling around him. The confrontation had delivered neither the bitter satisfaction of revenge nor the false comfort of easy reconciliation, but something more valuable, the dignity of truth and the freedom of clear boundaries. The main conference hall hummed with anticipation as employees gathered for Martin's first company-wide address since reclaiming leadership. The executive team occupied the front row, Catherine among them in her capacity as Director of Product Strategy, her demeanor professional if somewhat subdued. Martin stepped to the podium at precisely 9 a.m., his presence commanding immediate attention. The room quieted without need for formal introduction. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying the measured authority that had once defined Meridian's culture. For those who don't know me, I'm Martin Chambers, founder and CEO of Meridian Technologies. A ripple of whispers spread through the newer employees who knew him only as Catherine's husband, while veteran staff nodded with expressions of satisfied recognition. Yesterday, the board confirmed my return to active leadership. Today, I want to outline our path forward with clarity and purpose. A digital presentation appeared on the screen behind him, showing the new organizational structure. Catherine's name appeared in the product strategy box, positioned as a direct report to Martin, but with clear authority over her division. Meridian Technologies was built on two fundamental principles, Martin continued: innovation in technology and integrity in business practices. These principles remain non-negotiable. He outlined the restructured executive team, explaining each position's responsibilities and reporting relationships with precision. When he reached Catherine's role, he addressed the elephant in the room directly. Catherine Chambers will continue to lead our product strategy division, where her vision has created significant value. Her contributions in this area remain an asset to Meridian, and I expect everyone to maintain professional respect for her position. Catherine's composed nod acknowledged both the affirmation and its careful boundaries. Several employees exchanged glances, but Martin's matter-of-fact tone discouraged gossip. As for broader corporate changes, he continued, the proposed partnership with Vertex Capital has been declined. Meridian will remain independently owned and operated. He then unveiled a strategic roadmap that integrated Catherine's product innovations with his own vision for the company's future, a framework that acknowledged value while establishing clear direction. Success at Meridian will be measured by 3 metrics, Martin explained as he approached his conclusion: technical excellence, market performance, and ethical conduct. None of these is optional, and none outweighs the others. The subtle reference to recent events wasn't lost on the executives, but it came without recrimination, a standard being reset rather than a grievance being aired. I believe in the talent and integrity of this team, Martin finished, his gaze sweeping the room. We have work to do, boundaries to respect, and innovation to deliver. Let's move forward together. As the meeting concluded, Employees approached Martin with questions and comments, many expressing appreciation for the clear direction. Catherine maintained appropriate professional distance, focusing on her team members rather than attempting to share the spotlight. Near the exit, Harrison Wells paused beside Martin. "Clean execution," he observed quietly. "Leadership without vengeance." "The better path usually is," Martin replied, watching as the company he had built, lost, and reclaimed began adjusting to its new reality. One where contributions were valued, boundaries were clear, and leadership meant something more than mere control. The restructuring wasn't just organizational, but philosophical, a visible demonstration that principles could triumph over pride and wisdom over wounded ego. As employees dispersed to their departments, the atmosphere carried something that had been missing during the recent power struggles: authentic purpose. Martin returned to his office, the weight of victory balanced by the responsibility of leadership. The path ahead would require continued vigilance and wisdom, but the foundation had been reset with integrity intact. The morning light streamed through the windows of Martin's office, illuminating the expanded view from Meridian's new headquarters. 1 year had passed since the boardroom confrontation that had reset the company's trajectory. Martin stood at the window, observing the campus below, where employees moved with purpose between buildings. Quarterly reports on his desk confirmed what he already knew. Meridian had not merely survived the leadership transition, but thrived. Revenue had increased 27%. Employee retention had stabilized at industry-leading levels, and 3 breakthrough products had launched successfully under Catherine's product strategy leadership. A knock at the door preceded William Hargrove's entrance, the mentor who had guided Martin through his darkest moment, now arriving for their monthly lunch. "The board meeting went well," Hargrove noted, settling into a chair with the ease of familiarity. "That acquisition strategy you outlined impressed even the skeptics." Martin nodded, joining him at the small conference table. "It's amazing what clarity of purpose can accomplish. And speaking of clarity," Hargrove gestured toward the framed document on Martin's wall, "the divorce decree, displayed not as a reminder of failure, but as a milestone of boundaries properly established. How's that working out?" "Better than I expected," Martin acknowledged. "Catherine and I have found a professional rhythm that works. The personal relationship needed to end, but her talents are still valuable to Meridian." Through the glass walls, they could see Catherine in a distant conference room, leading a product team through a presentation. Her role had flourished once freed from the complexities of their marriage and the burden of corporate politics. "You know," Hargrove observed, "most men in your position would have eliminated any trace of her from the company." "That would have been easier," Martin admitted, "but not wiser." "The measure of leadership isn't control. It's bringing out the best in people, even when they've shown you their worst." Hargrove smiled, recognizing his own words, reflected back with the depth of lived experience. "You've come full circle, son." "Not quite a circle," Martin corrected thoughtfully. "More of a spiral. I've returned to leadership, but at a higher level of understanding. The silent partner and the executive now integrated into something more balanced." As they prepared to leave for lunch, Martin paused at his desk, running his hand over the company's original business plan, now framed alongside its current vision statement. The hardest lesson, he reflected, was recognizing that worth exists independent of others' recognition. We can support without erasing ourselves and lead without dominating others. Hargrove nodded in appreciation. "That's wisdom earned the hard way. The only way it ever comes," Martin replied, with the quiet certainty of a man who had faced betrayal and chosen dignity over vengeance. "True strength isn't about never falling or never being betrayed. It's about how you rise and who you become in the process. As they walked toward the elevator, employees nodded respectfully to Martin, not with the distant awe Catherine had cultivated, but with the authentic regard earned through balanced leadership. The company culture had transformed along with its founder, both emerging stronger for having weathered the crisis. The better path, Martin concluded, isn't the easier one, but it's the only one that lets you recognize the man in the mirror each morning.